Hey, so this is my trauma-informed practice protocol presentation, and here's my slideshow. For the protocol that I chose to do define, teach, and acknowledge expectations, and the definition of that is clear, explicit guidelines for how your students should act and complete tasks. And right here is a little picture with just like some guidelines or like rules that you could use. Some examples are never stop learning, always be willing to listen, provide clear rules and expectations, of course, come to class prepared, act in your students' best interest. And this is like guidelines for teachers. But here's some guidelines for this protocol. So you should always have clear expectations and rules that align with your school's district, because all schools have like certain rules and guidelines that they want each teacher to have in that classroom or for their whole district or whatever. Have explicit expectations that are clear and visible at all times to students. An example of this would be like posters and like how you decorate your class. A lot of times there are like rules and things set up just as a reminder so students can quickly look back at them, or you can quickly look back at them and go over them. Another guideline, you should create expectations that are culturally responsive, high, and observable. So of course you should always have high expectations for your students regardless of the classroom or the grade, because you should always motivate them and push them, and you should have culturally responsive ones, because children come from all backgrounds, and you want to have guidelines that essentially fit for every student, and they would align with their culture and their views and their ways of living. I think that's very important as educators, because all your students deserve to come to school and feel welcomed. And sometimes I guess it can get hard because you have like so many different cultures mixed in your classroom or whatever, and trying to find the right place to set those guidelines. And you should have guidelines that are observable, of course. So guidelines that you can observe and monitor, so you can like know and you can like tell them and redirect them. The next guideline, be sure to consistently express and enforce these expectations. So of course you should go over them, you should model them, you should several times a year, probably several times a week, because they are children and they go home to different rules and guidelines, and they go to different classes that have different rules and guidelines. So of course you're going to have to constantly teach them and redirect them and model those expectations. But after a while, your students should, like after a while of practicing those guidelines, your students should understand them and get the hang of them when it comes to your class. But of course you're still going to have to go over them. Have explicit and high expectations that promotes consistency. So when you have these explicit and high expectations, like I said, that promotes consistency and security for your children, especially children that may have faced trauma. They could be living in an unstable environment, and having these clear rules that they understand, like that they can easily understand, you can keep going over, and you strictly enforce them. It'll give them a sense of security, that they know that they'll have to like follow those rules every time they come to your class. The next one, having explicit and high expectations gives children a sense of security, as I just said, and routine, especially ones who have suffered with trauma. Like I just explained, routine. A lot of children don't have routine, so having a routine, I feel like that's very important for everyone, especially children. I know when I don't have a routine, I feel very sluggish, and I essentially feel like depressed about it. So putting these rules and implementing them will give them a sense of routine, especially when it comes to your class. And this is really good for children, with all children, and especially children who may be in an unstable environment or not used to this. Strategy for implementing these guidelines. Define your expectations when you first meet your students. Allow for feedback and questions. So I think that, first day, that's usually what happens. Teachers will go over their rules and expectations of all their children. And I think that you should clearly define them the first day so you can, and then, like I said, have them post it, keep them up to date so they can look back at them, so you can look back at them, so you can model them and practice them, and allow for feedback and questions. I think that that is essential. I know when I was in school, when my teachers would ask for us to ask us how we feel about those rules or guidelines or whatever, it would make me feel like I had some type of power in that classroom. And especially when teachers would allow us to make a guideline or two or something for the whole class, like things that we think that we should all follow, including the teacher. That just gave me a sense of power, feeling like I have a say in the classroom and that I belong there. I always love that. So I think that that is very important for teachers to allow for their students to have some input in the guidelines. The next strategy for implementing these guidelines, teach, review, and practice these expectations. Be explicit and positive when introducing your expectation. So as I've said a few times, you want to teach them clearly and you want to practice these expectations constantly throughout the school year, like I said, several times a week, and be positive and clear when announcing these expectations. You don't want to go into it kind of sounding bored or like they're just so strict and terrible. You want to be positive and bring a positive attitude to the environment. And the next strategy, monitor your students and reinforce the students who are appropriately following your expectations. Like if you see that children are doing the right thing and following those expectations, could positively reinforce them. And this could also go into children who are behaving inappropriately and not following those expectations, reinforce those expectations onto them. And, it could create a habit, get them in the swing of things. The next one, consistently practice and model your high expectations. That is crucial. And stay consistent with your high expectations to ensure that your students respect and understand them. If you're not consistent with your expectations and rules, then your students are not going to respect them or you. So you have to kind of go into it, like I said, saying what you mean and standing on what you mean, having consequences in place for students who don't follow those expectations. And, you have to go into it and stand on what you say so your students can respect you and those expectations and essentially follow them. And then here's a little picture of a teacher monitoring her student. And for an example, when setting these expectations for your students, you want to make sure that they're culturally relevant as well as relevant to your classroom and their grade level. So you don't want to go in, if you have a classroom with children who have a different culture, like ethnic students or something, you don't want to go in setting expectations that are just not realistic at all. I feel like learning your children's cultures and backgrounds, that's very essential to creating a positive and welcoming environment when creating your expectations and rules of your classroom. And you want to make sure that they're appropriate to the grade level. You don't want to have super young children and then set expectations that are just crazy for them. You want to make sure that they're aligned with whatever you're teaching and whoever you're teaching. If you're a second grade teacher, for example, you may set expectations and rules be respectful to your peers and teacher, be prepared for class with your proper materials, or come to class prepared to learn. So those are some guidelines that are, I feel age appropriate and grade appropriate, being respectful, being prepared, and being ready to learn. Yeah. If you have a child who is not being respectful to you or their peers, you could remind them of your expectations and model them, and use behaviorism or conditioning that involves negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement when they behave appropriately and respect your expectations. And discussions. Trauma-informed practice protocols are essential for any classroom, especially a SPED classroom. If you have a student who has faced trauma in their lifetime, you want them to feel loved, welcomed, safe, and supported in your classroom. I think that is so important. That is one of my main goals for all of my students. This is our moral obligation as educators, I believe. If children are neglected and abused at home by their peers, and their teachers do not make them feel safe, then who will? I stand on that. Like, that's something I've always said. I think teachers, they have such an important role in their children's lives. Like, you're with them for most of the day. And I don't know, I think that's so important. And for my summary, as previously stated, trauma-informed protocol practices are essential in any effective classroom. The strategy that I chose is acknowledge, teach, expectations. Each strategy is equally important to make all students, especially students that have trauma, feel safe in our classroom. I believe that no classroom can be an effective learning environment if your students do not feel welcomed and safe. If you're in a SPED classroom, it is equally as important to set high and explicit expectations for your students. I believe that. And for my last page, these are just my sources of where I got all of my information from. Thank you.